Good morning, everyone. This is Archbishop Richard Gagnon speaking to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, from the Catholic Centre in downtown Winnipeg, and this is our Friday report for Friday, October 23rd. And we find ourselves still within the pandemic reality, and of course the city of Winnipeg and surrounding areas are under the zone orange, so things are a little stricter now. However, we continue to go forward. We continue to be optimistic and trying as best we can to live the joy of the gospel, as St. Francis of Assisi used to say, to live your lives with the flavor of the gospel in spite of restrictions that are with us. And so today, for our Friday report, I'm going to begin with the short kind of overview of the first part of Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, as I said I would last week. And then I'll ask our communications director, Christian Martinez, to join us for a few questions, a few concerns relative to the Archdiocese in general. After all, the purpose of these Friday reports is simply to connect with the people of our Archdiocese and to provide you with some pieces of information that are happening within our community, our local church in southwestern Manitoba. So welcome all of you, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. So Fratelli Tutti, I kind of introduced last week. It's the Pope's third encyclical. And as I mentioned last week, it's kind of unique in a way because the Holy Father had this kind of singular meeting with the Grand Imam of the Al-Azhar. That's a famous, perhaps the most prestigious seat of learning in the Sunni Muslim world. And the Pope met him in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, and they jointly signed a document that has to do with human fraternity and living together. And the basic principles of that document found their way into the Pope's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, inspired by St. Francis of Assisi. Fratelli Tutti, in other words, you are all brothers. You are all brothers and sisters in the Lord. And so it's very interesting that both the Pope and the Imam have mutually agreed and found common ground to share universally with the world important thoughts relative to human fraternity. You know, it is kind of interesting in a way when you think about it. 800 years ago, when St. Francis of Assisi encountered for a whole week the Sultan of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, and spent the whole week with him. That whole encounter and dialogue and listening that happened there had an influence on the church for centuries afterwards, because if you go to the Holy Land today, and you'll find there the holy sites, the important places in our Lord's life, they're all under what is called the custody of the Holy Land, and that is under the Franciscan order. And that's because St. Francis of Assisi opened up pathways of dialogue, mutual respect with the Muslim world, and that enabled the Franciscans to continue, in spite of the 200 years war with the Crusades, to be present at those holy places in what we call the Holy Land. And so it's quite amazing. And then in 2019, last year, Pope Francis, who goes by the name Francis, met another very famous and powerful Muslim leader in Abu Dhabi, and they signed a mutual agreement regarding human friendship and human fraternity. So it's really quite amazing when you think about it. So my purpose here is simply to share with you a few points about the encyclical. I'll take the first 3 chapters very, very briefly. You know, the chapters are entitled, and these are my titles I put on these chapters. The first one, "The world is too often closed to human fraternity and friendship." This is a description of the world today and how fraternity and friendship throughout the world is fading because of certain trends internationally. And the Pope discusses that at some length. Very interesting. Then he goes on to tell a story from the Bible that provides a hopeful path for renewal and rebuilding friendship and fraternity, and that is precisely the story or the parable of the Good Samaritan. And finally, the third chapter that I'll deal with very, very briefly is a chapter that talks about openness. openness to others. And that permeates the whole encyclical towards the end. So very briefly, that first chapter, it's called "The World is Too Often Closed." Those are my words. It describes very much many of the trends today which make fraternity and human friendship undergo great difficulty today. For as many points he brings out in the encyclical, there are many there to consider, and he delves deeply into them. For example, we talk about today about globalization, for example, and how the world is shrinking, and how we are aware of one another more internationally. But unfortunately, that globalization, that reality of globalization, has to do more with the economic and financial realities of the world, and at times, unfortunately, the domination of powerful interests throughout the world. But really, it also includes, even though it's not often mentioned, the suppression and decline of local communities, local cultures, and local languages of people at the same time. And so the Pope goes on to talk about a kind of new colonialism that exists today, a colonialism which advocates ideologies in the world. And so through the internet, for example, which is highly influenced by powerful interests in the so-called first world, the smallest villages in India or South America are receiving ideological input which affects their cultures. And so globalization presents of itself many challenges. And so when cultures are suppressed, when the powerful are protecting themselves and their self-interest, when the history of cultures is suppressed, there's an increasing frustration and tension which also exists. And that's contrary to fraternity and friendship. And that's something we should very much be aware of in the world today. When you read that first chapter, you, I'm sure, cannot help but reflect on just about every news broadcast every day we receive on television of how one group is against another group, how there's constant criticism of certain groups, how some people look at themselves as victims, other people as oppressors, all kinds of divisions of unrest in the world today. We are surrounded by it. And again, the Holy Father points out that through this particular reality in our culture, that the manipulation of people is occurring, in which, self-interest, the part of certain groups and certain powerful lobbies are gaining power, are gaining influence in our communities and in our nations as well. And so he goes into that quite a bit at the same time. He also says, we are losing a sense of our history. How often have you heard it said today that, well, we're living in 2020. In 2020, things in the past don't really have the same value. In traditional cultures in the world, your ancestors, the people you came from, the values that were handed down to you, all of these are being cast aside for the sake of starting at zero, of square one, because it's 2020. And we forget what came before and that tremendous heritage that's been handed down to us. That's a reality in the first world. It's also a reality in the developing world as well. And so the Holy Father, he is not pessimistic. He is very, very hopeful. But at the same time, if you read that chapter, you will become aware of some important things that already we are familiar with as human beings exposed to international media and the trends in the world today. And all of this puts a tension between peoples, within families, within countries, and between countries at the same time. That's why the encyclical is very much concerned with human fraternity and social friendship. What is social friendship? Social friendship is defined by the Pope as transcending borders, transcending barriers, going across to the other, whom we normally would not associate with. A lot of these points that come out of the encyclical are things that we as a people of God in our Archdiocese and Synod have already intuitively recognized when we talked a lot about the importance of outreach to others, especially those on the peripheries of society. The second chapter is that story of the Good Samaritan, a powerful story. And the Pope invites us, with regards to that story, to ask ourselves, who do we identify with in that story? Are we the Good Samaritan who is very much aware of people lying on the road, people who are in need, the weak and the sick and so on? Or are we perhaps one of those people who simply wanted to walk on the other side of the road, who were religious people? The Holy Father goes into the story of the Good Samaritan in a rather deep way. And he says, let's be honest, all of us, to one degree or another, are very illiterate when it comes to caring for those who have fallen by the wayside. We may do some of that, but at the same time, there is so much around us in our world that the example of the Good Samaritan, the recognition of the other, who is not of the same culture, not of the same religion, but because of his humanity, to care for that person who is very much in need. And so the Holy Father in that second chapter uses that parable of the Good Samaritan as a door opening up to what he would call a roadmap for the future, a roadmap for a rebirth of fraternity. And the COVID-19 situation today has simply aggravated what already has been happening in terms of a fading fraternity in the world. COVID-19 has demonstrated to the international community and to ourselves personally how frail we are, and how those habits and routines we normally have are very much not all that solid. They can be shattered very easily as we seek for ways of trying to live our lives within the context of the restrictions of this pandemic. And so the Good Samaritan provides an opening towards how we are to approach our relationship with our neighbor. And so it's kind of a story, a powerful story and a lesson. The Imam of Al-Azhar has very much agreed with this story in the sense that it provides not only for Catholics and Christians, but for all people, a good example of human fraternity. And that has been part of our experience as Christians. We've always had a sense of the need of others throughout the world, in the developing world, and that continues. But today, because of the pressures that damage fraternity and friendship, there's need nowadays more than ever for a rebirth, a renaissance of fraternity in the world. Finally, the third chapter has to do with the world and being open to the world. This whole idea of social friendship, crossing boundaries. The Holy Father goes into, for example, the early Christian community and how they saw the needs of those around them and shared their goods with people who were in need. He talks about the principle of the destination, the universal destination of good. Christians believe in the importance of private property, but private property does not transcend or it does not push out of the way a higher value, and that is a universal destination of goods, and that the poor also have a certain right for opportunities in the world and for resources. And even though we may agree that, yes, I believe in equal opportunity for everybody, not everybody has the same opportunities because of the situation they find themselves in. The Holy Father also, for example, will point out that we all have human dignity that is equal under God, under God's creation. And just because we're born in a part of the world where there is oppression and poverty, dictatorship, all kinds of problems, does not mean that person has less dignity than our own. And so the whole question of the importance of immigration, the importance of the duty of the rich towards the poor, all of these questions are discussed and opened up in a third chapter of being open to the world in a sense of social friendship, transcending borders and boundaries. So, I mentioned last Friday when I gave the introduction to Fratelli Tutti that this would be a very challenging encyclical, and it certainly is if we pay attention to it. But as the Holy Father says very clearly, this demands an alternate way of looking at the world, an alternate way of looking at God's creation in our responsibilities therein. Well, you've been very patient this morning. My only purpose simply has been to open up this topic for you and maybe encourage you to download the encyclical Fratelli Tutti and have a look at it. There may be some things there of interest that may help us in our Christian vocation to fraternity and social friendship. May God bless you. Welcome, Christian.
Your Grace, thank you once again for having me on your Friday report.
Thank you for coming.
So we have a few questions here for you. Firstly, when you gave us an overview of the encyclical of the Holy Father, we've received feedback about it, and people are very appreciative of the overview. So thank you for that. And the first question here is, what 3 words would you use to describe Pope Francis?
Thank you, Christian. I'm glad you didn't fall asleep during my little talk about Fratelli Tutti. It's always a challenge making an encyclical sound interesting because it's a bit denser than normal reading. But as I mentioned to you earlier, the Pope's writings are very accessible. His language is simple enough, and very accessible. But now I thought about your question, what 3 words I would use to describe Pope Francis. Well, that's something, isn't it? So I thought of my encounters with the Pope in my work with the CCCB. Normally in December we go to Rome, and this year it's canceled because of the pandemic. Too bad, but it's canceled. But in my previous encounters with him, and from what I've seen in his various activities, the 3 words that come to mind, Christian, are joyful, relational, and focused. That's how I would, without giving it a lot of thought, but he's certainly a joyful man. Now, when you see pictures of Pope Francis, sometimes he's not smiling, and he has a rather, sort of a serious sort of countenance, you might say. But that's understandable because there's so many photographs of him that are taken. I mean, he'd be smiling all day long, but it's kind of the old-fashioned way. If you look at photographs years ago, you were kind of meant not to always smile, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of that way with him. But really, Pope Francis is a light-hearted person. He's never far away from a laugh or a little joke or something like that. So he is very joyful. And his apostolic letter, post-synodal letter, Gaudium Evangelium Gaudii, the joy of the gospel, demonstrates that when he gives us a teaching on evangelization. So living the joy of the gospel, I really honestly do believe he lives the joy of the gospel, with the tremendous weight he has in his life as Pope. The second word, relational, to encounter Pope Francis is really a matter of dialogue. Even when there are formal meetings with people, he loves to listen, to receive feedback, to give feedback. He is very dialogical, he's relational. And this goes back to his life as a priest and as a bishop in Argentina. So he's a very, very good pastoral man that way. You might say he's an old-fashioned type of pastor who knows his people and the people know him, and he knows how to sit down and have a cup of tea or a beer or simply to go on a walk with somebody. He's very relational. That's a beautiful thing I've noticed about him.
Your Grace, some people say that about you. What do you say about that?
About myself? Well, I don't know. I like tea. I do like beer. I do like going for walks. But no, Pope Francis is very exceptional. The last word actually comes to mind is focused on his goals. Joyful as he is, dialogical as he is, relational, he's very focused. And when you encounter him in discussions on various topics, he listens intently. He knows where he wants to go. As his sister said about him once when she was being interviewed in Argentina, he knows who he is. The Pope knows who he is. And that means that he knows what his purpose is, he knows what his responsibilities are as a bishop in Argentina, and certainly as Pope. He's focused. But that's combined with those personality traits I just mentioned to you. And I think it's a very effective and powerful combination.
That's fascinating, Your
Yeah.
Grace. The first two words I had heard as a description of Pope Francis, but the third,
Yeah,
focused, that I was kind of surprised by that.
very much so. He's very focused.
Wow. Okay, so we have a second question here, Your Grace, and I think the thrust of it is people wanting to get an update of the pastoral ministries of the Archdiocese or what's happening in the church. So the question here is, will there be faith events in 2021?
Well, okay, that demands a lot of faith considering our situation, right? As far as the pastoral services are concerned of the Archdiocese, obviously we are laboring under a lot of limitations. But what I've been doing, I have been pushing very much, maybe pushing is the wrong word, let's call it motivating, our synod. Our synod was a tremendous event in the Archdiocese. And pastoral services, they see that for sure. Our director of pastoral services, the individual coordinators and so on, that there's a lot in the synod that can be applied during this pandemic time. Now, I don't just mean, for example, some of the original planning, which actually is going on, but at a much slower rate. For example, just the other day, there was a listening session in one of the parishes in the countryside, and it was very successful. A small number of people attended, but what was good about it was that everybody could speak. Everybody had a chance to share on the goals of their parish community. And so I certainly would, stress and to encourage that work of holding listening sessions in parishes to work on parish plans in spite of the COVID-19 reality. I would encourage that to continue. So that is continuing at a slower rate, but also too, the Synod has many recommendations. And so I've encouraged each department of the pastoral services to look at that and to see how the Synod can help us achieve our goals. What are our goals? Overarching themes: formation in the Christian faith, handing on the faith, and outreach to those in need. And so that's what we're doing. Now, one of the archdiocesan plans is to hold another archdiocesan meeting, quote unquote, virtually now, of our delegates and our clergy to talk about the Synod under these circumstances. I really believe the Synod has within itself, that great event in the Archdiocese a couple of years ago, the principles of the Synod have within themselves very important kind of roadmaps for us to navigate through the pandemic. How am I going to work on formation? How am I going to work on outreach? And formation, well, with lots of limitations, yes, but these are concrete ways we might consider doing that during this pandemic time. We are all waiting for, of course, a lifting of this veil of the pandemic so that we can once again have our archdiocesan activities, our meetings, our retreats, and so on. But right now, we're going to work within these limitations. So that's how I would approach that problem. The problem is simply this: how to live the joy of the gospel within the pandemic, using the Synod as a means of doing that. Something to think about. So I've asked our Synod coordinator, Linda Chupka, to connect frequently with the pastoral services and with the deaneries, and let's talk about how we can work at this together. That's how I would approach that.
Absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned, Your Grace, is one of the really wonderful stories in the Archdiocese right now is a listening session that was held by one of our parishes. So one of the things that we're planning actually is to do some sort of an interview with the people who participated in that listening session, and looking forward to sharing that with everyone as well. So that is forthcoming.
Excellent, excellent. And I should also add, Christian, that it's come my way now and again from some parishes in the Archdiocese that there are phoning trees, and every parishioner on the parish list has been phoned at least once, maybe more, just to touch base with them. I really think that's fundamental.
Absolutely.
That's really fundamental. And especially at this time, because there is alienation. as I mentioned in Fratelli Tutti, discussing that, the COVID-19 has aggravated the fading of fraternity, friendship, and community, right? We must find ways of outreaching via telephone, via the virtual means of social communication to do that.
Okay, Your Grace, so switching gears here a little bit to speak about a very important topic of MAiD, medical assistance in dying, and in particular Bill C-7. So there's an open letter to all Canadians from religious leaders in Canada. We made it available on our website, and you are one of the signatories of that letter, so to talk about that. But also, there was a CCCB statement dated October 20th on the same issue. So really of crucial importance. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. That letter you mentioned, Christian, signed by many religious communities in Canada and by certain groups representing the disadvantaged. There are about 70 advocacy groups representing people with disabilities in Canada have opposed this whole notion of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Bill C-7 builds upon that. It widens the whole scope of what is called MAiD in Canada, which is a medical assistance in dying, which is a euphemism, because medical assistance in dying, those words actually describe palliative care. They don't describe ending the life of a person. I wonder if Canadians are aware that during this pandemic, the government of Canada is seeking to pass a bill, Bill C-7, which will widen the parameters of MAiD in Canada. So I don't know if people are really aware of that, and the government wants this to go through at this time without keeping faithful to their word to consult Canadians, as they said they would after a 5-year period. MAiD was introduced in 2016. The 5 years aren't up yet. There's been no national consultation. There's been a very brief 2-week shallow consultation through electronic media, which never even asked the question, do you agree with MAiD? It assumed that you did. Many people were very angered over that. Many thousands of letters have gone into the government opposing MAiD, period. So there was no consultation. The government did not appeal the decision of the Quebec Superior Court, which struck down MAiD because it didn't go far enough. And so it seems to me that the government of our country wants there to be a more expanded version of euthanasia in Canada and physician-assisted suicide. That's what Bill C-7 is all about. And I would encourage our people to certainly to make your views known. This is very, very important because we are citizens of our country. Our voice is important, and our viewpoint is very important on this. Physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia have been introduced into our country 4 years ago, and it is causing great angst within our communities, families even, disagreement within families. People have a sense of powerlessness. When you look at the whole notion of reasons why people ask for MAiD, the most common reason is due to isolation, despair, depression, no support. People feel alone. They want to end it all. This has been stated by people who advocate for MAiD. And so the pandemic has aggravated that. In the middle of the pandemic, we have this bill that's been introduced. I would also say, with regards to this question, Christian, that palliative care is a topic that we don't hear much about, is it? Mm-hmm. But only 1 in 3 Canadians apparently have access to palliative care. And what does palliative care do? Palliative care helps people not to feel alone, not to feel despairing, to feel supported. Why are we not hearing about this? What we hear about is a strong focus and motivation to pass a further widening of the bill which exists for MAiD in Canada. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops have called Bill C7 deeply flawed, unjust, and morally pernicious. I would encourage all of those hearing this broadcast today to make your views known to your representatives in Ottawa. Your voice is very important. So it's an important and serious topic in our country right now.
Your Grace, if there's someone who'd like to learn more about the issue, where might they go to get that information?
Well, the first thing I would say, go to the website for the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. You'll find there some material on the MAiD issue and background. That should be very informative for you.
Yeah. So, Your Grace, finally for me on this topic, the title of that open letter is "We Can and Must Do Much Better," which is really interesting.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, in Fratelli Tutti, the Pope talks about the importance of fraternity and social friendship, and so why are people asking for MAiD? MAiD itself is not right. It's wrong. Somebody has to do the killing, right? But where we could do better would be to provide the supports and education on people. And sometimes we're not very good Samaritans in this issue in our country. We can't just sort of push it aside, right? It's with us, and it's increasing. The numbers of cases are increasing in Canada. So what does that tell us?
Your Grace, so the final question for me for the Friday report today is to endeavor for us to end on a lighter note. So you're the Archbishop of Winnipeg with many cares and concerns, and at the same time the president of the CCCB. So obviously you deal with many matters, hear a variety of perspectives, very difficult issues that always come across your desk. So just a simple question here, because as Christians, we aren't a people who just stay in despair. There's always a reason to hope. So a simple question. How do you have fun nowadays?
How do I have fun? Doing Friday reports, maybe. Well, I certainly, I enjoy reading a lot, I enjoy also hiking and going into the forest and or walks in that way. I enjoy that very much. I enjoy music of all sorts. Actually, I have a very great interest in that. I think generally Christian, God's creation is a wonderful thing, and people are very interesting too. I'm still quite new in Winnipeg, and the Manitoba reality, the culture here, the people here, all of these things, I still find many new things, and that in itself is exciting to me as well. So try to combine a little bit of the artistic, a little bit of the intellectual, a little bit of the physical. I find that to be quite rewarding and fulfilling. And the people I work with, Christian, including yourself, are people who are people of faith, and it's very encouraging to be with them and very affirming. So my job is to do the same for them.
Well, thank you very much for that, Your Grace, and for our viewers, thank you so much again for joining us. And if you have any questions for the Archbishop, please don't hesitate to send us a note. You can send us an email, communications@archwinnipeg.ca, or any of our social media platforms as well. So thank you again, Your Grace.
Thank you, Christian. Well, there's our Friday report for October 23rd. Thank you very much for joining us. I ask God's blessing upon all of you and your families as we walk together with the rest of our community, the wider community, during these days of the pandemic. But these are opportunities, too, to practice what Pope Francis is teaching us in his encyclical. The Lord be with you all, and may he keep you safe, and may he bless you and your families, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless you.